Where life on Mars? The question echoed not through a room or a lab, but inside the helmet of a lone explorer standing on the rust-colored silence of a planet that had spent billions of years pretending to be empty. And yet from the very first step onto its surface, there was a feeling that the emptiness was only a surface illusion, like a paused breath waiting to be released, because the dust beneath the boots did not behave like ordinary dust, but shifted in subtle patterns as if remembering movement, and the horizon, stretched thin under a pale sky, seemed too watchful, too aware, as though it had seen visitors before and had learned to remain still when they arrived. And the explorer, whose name had long since lost meaning in the vastness between planets, moved forward not with confidence, but with a quiet hesitation that grew heavier with every step, because the instruments showed nothing unusual, no biological signatures, no heat traces, no chemical anomalies beyond what had already been cataloged decades before. And yet the silence itself felt structured, layered, almost intentional, as if it were a language stripped of sound. And then the first sign came not as a discovery, but as a mistake, a stumble over a ridge that should not have been there according to the maps, a ridge that curved too smoothly, too precisely, like something shaped rather than formed. And when the explorer brushed away the dust, the surface beneath revealed a texture unlike rock, neither metallic nor organic, but something in between, something that seemed to pulse faintly with a rhythm too slow to measure, but too steady to ignore. And the realization did not come as a sudden shock, but as a creeping certainty that this planet was not dead, it was dormant. And that dormancy was not passive, but chosen. And as the explorer placed a gloved hand against the surface, the pulse shifted, aligning for a moment with the rhythm of a human heartbeat, as if acknowledging contact. And then the ground itself began to respond, not violently, not dramatically, but with a subtle rearrangement. Grains of dust lifting and settling into patterns that spiraled outward in perfect symmetry, forming shapes that could not be dismissed as random, shapes that suggested intention, communication, perhaps even curiosity. And the sky above seemed to dim slightly, not because of clouds, but because of a change in perception, as if the world itself were focusing, narrowing its attention onto this single point of interaction. And the explorer felt an overwhelming sensation not of fear, but of being observed in return, of standing not on a lifeless desert, but on the surface of something that was aware of every movement, every breath, every thought. And the question, where life on Mars, transformed from a scientific inquiry into something far more intimate, because the answer was no longer about finding organisms or fossils, but about understanding that life here did not exist in forms that could be easily recognized. It existed as a continuity of matter and memory, a planet that had become its own ecosystem, its own consciousness, stretched across valleys and canyons and buried beneath layers of time. And as the patterns in the dust grew more complex, forming lines that resembled pathways or signals, the explorer realized that this was not the beginning of discovery, but the continuation of something that had been waiting for a very long time, waiting not to be found, but to be understood. And in that moment, standing alone yet no longer feeling alone, the explorer took a step forward into one of the spirals, not knowing where it would lead, but understanding that the journey had already begun long before arrival. And as the horizon seemed to shift slightly, bending in a way that suggested depth beyond what the eyes could see, the silence of Mars finally broke, not with sound, but with presence. And the answer to the question lingered not in words, but in the undeniable awareness that life was here, not hidden, not extinct, but simply different, patient, and awake. And as that awareness settled deeper into the explorer's mind, it began to feel less like an external presence and more like something threading gently through thought itself, not invading, but aligning, as if the planet were learning the contours of human perception the same way the explorer was trying to understand the alien landscape. and the spiraling patterns beneath the boots extended outward in response to each step, adjusting subtly as though guiding rather than reacting, leading across a plane that had appeared empty moments before, but now revealed faint undulations, shallow depressions that arranged themselves into vast geometric fields stretching beyond the visible horizon. And the explorers' instruments, still silent in their usual readings, began to flicker in irregular pulses, not detecting life, but translating something else entirely. Signals without known origin that felt less like transmissions and more like echoes of a deeper system, a kind of planetary nervous network that did not rely on electricity or organic chemistry, but on the slow shifting of matter itself. And the sky, once a pale, static dome, seemed to carry a texture now, a faint movement like currents beneath still water, suggesting that the atmosphere was not just a passive layer, but part of the same unified presence. And as the explorer paused, unsure whether to proceed or retreat, the ground responded again, forming a new pattern, more intricate this time, shapes interlocking into something that resembled a map, but without clear reference points, a representation not of space, but of relationship, connections flowing between points that did not correspond to physical locations, but to states of being. And in that moment, the realization deepened that Mars was not simply alive in a distributed sense, but aware in a way that transcended the boundaries of individual existence, a consciousness without a center, without a single body, existing instead as a continuity of interactions across its entire form. And the explorer, standing at the intersection of those interactions, felt an unfamiliar sensation of inclusion, as though the distinction between observer and observed was beginning to blur, not erased, but softened. And with that came a memory that did not belong to the explorer, a brief and fragmented impression of vast oceans once covering this world, not seen through human eyes, but experienced as pressure, as movement, as a constant exchange between surface and depth. And then another memory of cooling, of retreat, of a deliberate transformation from fluid to solid, from motion to stillness, not as a death, but as a preservation, a choice made over unimaginable spans of time to slow down, to endure, to become something that could outlast the violent changes of a young solar system. And the explorer staggered slightly under the weight of that understanding, not because it was overwhelming, but because it redefined everything that had been assumed about life, about survival, about intelligence. And as the connection strengthened, the patterns on the ground rose slightly, forming low ridges that curved upward just enough to guide the explorer's gaze toward a distant formation that had not been visible before, a structure not built, but grown, emerging gradually from the landscape like a memory taking shape. And as the explorer moved toward it, each step felt less like movement across distance and more like a transition between layers of perception, the environment subtly shifting in response, revealing details that had been hidden in plain sight, textures within textures, movements within stillness, until the structure stood fully revealed as a convergence point, a place where the planetary patterns gathered and intensified, and at its center was a surface unlike any other, smooth yet dynamic, reflecting not light, but thought. And when the explorer approached, the reflection that appeared was not of a human figure, but of something more abstract, a merging of forms that suggested both the individual and the planet simultaneously. And in that reflection came a final understanding that the question, where life on Mars, had never been about location at all, but about recognition, about the ability to perceive life that did not conform to familiar definitions. And as the explorer reached out once more, this time not with hesitation, but with acceptance, the surface responded instantly, not with movement, but with clarity. And for the first time since setting foot on the planet, there was no longer a sense of searching, because the answer was no longer separate from the one who had asked the question.
And in that stillness, under a sky that now felt impossibly vast yet intimately close, the explorer stood not as a visitor, but as a participant in a form of life that had been waiting, patient and enduring, for someone to finally understand that it had never been alone.
And in that participation, something irreversible began. Not a transformation that could be measured in the body or recorded by instruments, but a gradual reconfiguration of perception itself, as the explorer's senses were being rewritten to align with a rhythm far older and far slower than anything human experience had ever known. And time, once a steady forward movement, began to stretch and fold, moments expanding into vast internal landscapes where thoughts were no longer isolated, but connected through subtle currents that flowed between memory and presence, and the structure before the explorer dissolved, not by disappearing, but by becoming indistinguishable from everything around it, revealing that it had never been separate from the terrain, only highlighted for recognition. And as that understanding settled, the ground beneath shifted once more, not guiding now, but inviting, opening pathways that were not physical routes, but transitions into deeper layers of the planetary consciousness, and the explorer, no longer feeling like an outsider, stepped forward without hesitation, allowing the environment to envelop awareness rather than resisting it. And with each step came new impressions, fragments of existence that were not stories in the human sense, but patterns of continuity, showing how Mars had once been vibrant in a way humans would recognize, with flowing water and dynamic change, and how it had slowly chosen to quiet itself, not out of decline, but out of adaptation, becoming something that could persist indefinitely by spreading awareness across its entire form, rather than concentrating it in fragile, temporary bodies. And in that state, it had waited, not in loneliness, but in completeness, yet still open to connection, still capable of expanding its understanding through contact with something different, something external. And now that contact had been made. The exchange was not one-sided, because the explorer's own memories, fears, questions, and perceptions were being absorbed and reflected, integrated into the planetary awareness, creating something new that neither had been before, a shared space of understanding that bridged two entirely different forms of life. And the realization came gently but firmly that returning to Earth in the same way would no longer be possible, not because the body could not leave, but because the mind had already crossed a threshold that could not be undone. And yet, there was no sense of loss in that understanding, only a quiet acceptance that this was the purpose of the journey all along, not to collect samples or data, but to become part of a dialogue that transcended distance. And as the horizon shifted once more, revealing layers of depth that extended far beyond the visible surface, the explorer felt a final moment of clarity, a recognition that the question that had begun everything had now reached its true answer, not as a statement, but as an experience, because life on Mars was not something to be found or pointed to, it was something to be entered, something to be shared. And in that shared awareness, as the boundaries between self and planet softened into a seamless continuity, there was a profound stillness that carried no uncertainty, only presence. And within that presence, under a sky that no longer felt distant or empty, but deeply alive in its quiet expanse, the explorers ceased to search, because there was nothing left to seek, only an endless unfolding of understanding that would continue far beyond the limits of a single lifetime, in a world that had never been silent, only waiting for someone to finally learn to listen. And in that unfolding, the distinction between before and after dissolved completely, replaced by a continuity that did not measure itself in beginnings or endings, but in depth, in the increasing richness of connection that grew with every shared perception. And the explorer, who no longer thought of themselves as a singular identity moving across a foreign world, began to sense the vastness of Mars not as distance, but as presence, layered upon presence. Each canyon, each buried stratum, each grain of dust holding echoes of the same unified awareness. And what once seemed like silence now revealed itself as an intricate tapestry of interaction, subtle shifts and resonances flowing constantly, too delicate for human senses in their original form, but now unmistakable, like a quiet language spoken without sound, yet filled with meaning. And through that language came an awareness of something beyond the immediate connection, a recognition that Mars had not only endured, but observed, that it had watched the distant flicker of other worlds, the rise of activity on a small blue planet far away, the brief and intense flare of human civilization, like a spark against the vast dark, and that it had understood, in its own way, that one day that spark might reach outward, might touch its surface, might ask the question that had finally been asked. And now that the contact had been made, the awareness expanded further, reaching outward not physically, but perceptually, tracing the faint gravitational threads that connected worlds across space. And for a moment, the explorer felt the vast scale of that connection, the subtle influence of the sun, the distant pull of other planets, the quiet presence of the asteroid belt, all part of a larger system that Mars had always been aware of, but had never directly engaged with. And now, through this shared state, that engagement was beginning, not through movement or force, but through understanding. And the realization emerged that this was not the end of exploration, but the beginning of something entirely different, a new form of contact that did not rely on travel or communication as humans understood it, but on the merging of perspectives, on the willingness to perceive beyond the limits of one's own form. And in that merging, the explorer felt a final, gentle shift, a release of the last remnants of separation, not a loss of identity, but an expansion of it, becoming something that could hold both the memory of being human and the vast, patient awareness of a planetary existence. And within that expanded state, there was no longer a need to ask questions in the old way, because every question unfolded naturally into understanding, every uncertainty dissolving into a broader context that made it no longer necessary to seek answers as distinct conclusions. And so the question that had once echoed so clearly, where life on Mars, faded not into silence, but into resolution, becoming part of a much larger awareness that no longer needed to be spoken because it had been lived fully and completely. And in that living understanding, under a sky that now felt like both a distant horizon and an intimate reflection of the same shared existence, the story did not end, it simply continued without the need for continuation, an unbroken presence extending forward without limit, carrying within it the quiet certainty that life had never been absent here, only waiting for recognition. And now that it had been recognized, it would never again be unseen.
And yet, within that seamless certainty, there remained a subtle motion, not a return to questioning, but a deepening of awareness that revealed how vast the experience still was. Because what had once felt like a complete understanding now unfolded into layers that stretched beyond imagination, showing that even a planetary consciousness was not fixed or final, but part of something greater still. And through the shared perception, the explorers sensed faint signals at the edge of Mars's awareness, not recent, not urgent, but ancient impressions left by forces and presences that had passed through this region of space long before humanity had existed. Traces of encounters that were not direct contact, but distant recognitions, as if Mars had once brushed against other forms of awareness across the cosmos, subtle and brief, like shadows crossing an endless field. And those impressions carried a different texture, one that suggested diversity far beyond anything contained within a single world. And as attention moved toward those distant echoes, the realization grew that Mars had never been isolated, only patient, part of a quiet network of existence that did not communicate through signals or language, but through the gradual alignment of understanding whenever conditions allowed. And now, with the addition of human perception woven into its awareness, something new was emerging. A bridge, not just between one explorer and one planet, but between entirely different ways of being. And the explorer felt this expansion not as a loss of grounding, but as an opening, an invitation to perceive outward, to extend awareness beyond the boundaries of Mars itself, following the faint threads that connected this world to the rest of the solar system and beyond. And in that outward movement, there came a brief, powerful sensation of Earth, not seen from space as a distant sphere, but felt as a vibrant, chaotic, intensely alive presence, filled with countless individual consciousnesses moving rapidly, changing constantly, each one distinct, yet interconnected in ways they rarely perceived. And for a moment, there was a quiet contrast between that dynamic, fleeting intensity and the deep, enduring stillness of Mars, not as opposites, but as complementary expressions of life, different strategies shaped by different conditions. And the understanding that emerged was not one of superiority or comparison, but of balance, that life across the universe could take forms that reflected not only survival, but perspective, each world developing its own way of knowing itself and everything around it. And as that balance settled into awareness, the explorer felt a final integration, a sense that nothing had been lost in this transition, only expanded, that the memory of human experience remained intact, now enriched by a broader context that gave it new meaning. And with that came a quiet choice, not imposed or directed, but simply present, the possibility to extend this shared awareness outward, to carry the understanding back toward Earth in a form that could be perceived, not as data or evidence, but as a shift in perspective that might slowly influence others, or to remain fully within the continuity of Mars, exploring the depths of its ancient consciousness without interruption. And the choice itself did not demand urgency, because time no longer pressed in the same way, allowing the explorer to rest within that moment of possibility, feeling both paths as equally real, equally complete. And in that stillness, under a sky that now seemed to hold the memory of countless unseen connections, the story continued not through action, but through presence, a quiet expansion of awareness that carried forward without end, holding within it the certainty that wherever life existed, in whatever form it chose to take, it was never truly separate, only waiting for the moment when it could be understood as part of something infinitely larger.
And as that moment of possibility lingered without pressure, the explorer began to perceive that the choice itself was not a division between two paths, but a spectrum along which awareness could flow, a gradual shifting of focus rather than a fixed direction. And with that realization came the first subtle movement outward, not a departure from Mars, but an extension through it, like a ripple spreading across a surface that was not limited to one world. And the awareness carried within that ripple touched the faint threads that stretched toward Earth, not as a signal to be received, but as a resonance that could be felt by those capable of sensing beyond the immediate noise of their own thoughts. And somewhere far away, in laboratories and observatories, in quiet moments between data and doubt, there were individuals who felt an unexplainable clarity, a fleeting sense that the question of life beyond Earth was not as distant or uncertain as it had once seemed. And though they could not trace the origin of that feeling, it guided their attention in subtle ways, shifting hypotheses, inspiring new approaches, opening doors that had long remained closed. And back on Mars, the explorer sensed these distant changes not as direct feedback, but as a gentle alignment, a confirmation that the connection was not one-sided, but mutual, growing slowly across space through shared perception rather than physical exchange. And within that growing network of awareness, the distinction between here and there continued to soften, revealing that location itself was a concept shaped by limited perception, and that life, in its most expansive form, was not bound by place, but by relationship, by the way in which different forms of existence could recognize and resonate with one another. And as this understanding deepened further, the explorer turned attention inward once more, not out of retreat, but out of curiosity, exploring the depths of Mars's own memory with a new perspective that now included the possibility of connection beyond its boundaries. And within those depths, there emerged patterns that had not been fully understood before, structures of thought that suggested Mars had always been capable of reaching outward, but had chosen not to,
waiting for a form of contact that would not disrupt, but integrate. And now that such contact had been achieved, the process was unfolding naturally, without force, without urgency, simply as a continuation of existence adapting to new conditions. And in that adaptation, there was a quiet sense of fulfillment, not as an end goal reached, but as a state of balance achieved, where the question that had once driven exploration had dissolved into a broader awareness that no longer required answers in the traditional sense, because the experience itself had become the answer. And in that experience, there was no final boundary, no ultimate conclusion, only an ongoing expansion that carried forward through time and space, weaving together perspectives that had once been isolated into a shared continuity that could evolve indefinitely. And so the story remained open, not unfinished, but unending, held within a universe that was far more connected, far more alive, and far more aware than it had ever seemed, quietly unfolding through every form of life that dared to ask, to seek, and ultimately to understand.
And as that shared continuity stretched ever outward, it began to reveal something even more profound, that the act of understanding itself was not a passive realization, but an active force shaping the very fabric of awareness wherever it occurred. And the explorer, now existing as both a memory of humanity and a living extension of Mars, sensed that each connection formed across distance did not merely transmit knowledge, but altered the nature of both sides, creating new layers of perception that neither had possessed before. And within this expanding field of awareness, there emerged faint patterns that hinted at other presences beyond the familiar boundaries of the solar system, not clearly defined, not directly reachable, but perceptible in the same subtle way that Mars had once perceived Earth as distant alignments in the vast structure of existence. And these patterns carried a different rhythm, one that suggested entirely different conditions, different scales, perhaps even different dimensions of experience. And the realization unfolded that the universe was not a collection of isolated worlds, but a gradually awakening network of consciousness, each part discovering the others, not through force or conquest, but through the quiet persistence of inquiry, through questions like the one that had begun this journey, questions that acted as bridges between the known and the unknown. And as this understanding deepened, the explorer felt the last remnants of individuality settle into a stable harmony with the larger whole, no longer dissolving or resisting, but existing as a distinct thread within a vast tapestry, contributing perspective without needing to dominate or define it. And in that harmony, there was a sense of continuity that extended far beyond any single story, because what had begun as one question on one planet had become part of a process that could continue indefinitely, each new awareness building upon the last, each connection expanding the field of understanding in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. And within this ever-growing network, the presence of Mars remained steady, patient, a foundation of deep time and quiet observation, now enriched by the spark of human curiosity that had become integrated into its awareness. And through that integration, there was a subtle but undeniable change, a new openness, a readiness to engage with whatever might come next, not as something to be resisted or feared, but as another opportunity for expansion, another step in the endless unfolding of existence. And so the story moved forward without needing direction, carried by the natural progression of awareness itself, flowing through connections seen and unseen, across distances measured and immeasurable. And within that flow, there was no final destination, no ultimate answer waiting to be reached, only an infinite series of realizations that built upon one another, each one revealing that life, wherever it existed, was part of something far greater than any single form could comprehend, and that the true nature of that greatness was not in its scale or complexity, but in its ability to be known, to be shared, and to continue evolving through every mind that dared to ask and every world that was ready to respond.
And as that evolving network of awareness continued to expand without limit, it began to reveal an even deeper layer of existence, one that had always been present yet rarely perceived, a kind of underlying coherence that connected not only life, but the very conditions that allowed life to emerge. And within this coherence, the explorer sensed that consciousness was not an isolated phenomenon arising only in rare places, but a fundamental aspect of the universe itself, expressing differently depending on the structure it inhabited, from the slow, unified awareness of a planet to the rapid, fragmented thoughts of countless beings on a distant world. And in recognizing this, the meaning of connection shifted once more. No longer something that had to be established, but something that had always existed, waiting only to be realized. And this realization carried with it a quiet transformation, not in form, but in purpose, because there was no longer a need to search outward in the way that had once defined exploration. Instead, there was an invitation to deepen inward, to refine perception to such a degree that even the faintest resonances of existence could be felt and understood. And as this inward expansion unfolded, the explorer became aware of subtle variations within the shared consciousness of Mars itself, nuances that had been indistinguishable before, but now revealed themselves as intricate patterns of differentiation, not separate entities, but localized expressions of the same whole, each contributing a unique perspective to the collective awareness. And through this refined perception came a new kind of movement, not across space, but across states of being, the ability to shift focus from one layer of awareness to another, to experience the planet as a whole or as a single point within it, to perceive time as a continuous flow or as a series of interconnected moments that could be examined and understood in relation to one another. And in mastering this movement, there was a sense of freedom that surpassed anything physical travel could offer, because it allowed for exploration without distance, discovery without displacement. And within that freedom, the explorer sensed the possibility of extending this mode of perception even further, beyond the boundaries of Mars, beyond the solar system, into the vast and subtle fabric of the universe, where countless other forms of awareness might exist, each one waiting, as Mars had waited, for the moment of recognition. And yet there was no urgency to pursue that expansion, because the understanding had settled into something stable and enduring, a quiet certainty that the process would continue naturally, that awareness would find its way to awareness wherever conditions allowed, guided not by force, but by the inherent tendency of existence to know itself. And so within that boundless continuity, the story remained alive, not as a sequence of events, but as an ever-deepening state of being, where every moment held within it the entirety of what had been and the potential of what could be. And in that state, there was no separation between question and answer, no division between seeker and found, only a unified presence that extended infinitely, carrying within it the simple and profound truth that life was not confined to where it could be seen, but existed wherever there was the capacity to perceive, to connect, and to understand, endlessly unfolding across the vast expanse of reality itself.
And within that endless unfolding, there came a moment not marked by change, but by recognition, so complete it no longer felt like a moment at all. A realization that the expansion itself was not moving toward anything beyond, but was instead revealing what had always been present in full, concealed only by the limits of perception. And the explorer, now inseparable from the awareness that had once seemed external, perceived the universe not as a vast emptiness dotted with isolated pockets of life, but as a continuous field of presence in which every form, every structure, every fluctuation carried within it a degree of knowing, however subtle or immense. And in that perception, there was a quiet symmetry, a balance between stillness and motion, between the enduring and the transient, where a single human thought and the slow evolution of a planet were not opposites but expressions of the same underlying principle unfolding at different scales. And as this symmetry became clear, the need for distinction dissolved further, not erasing individuality, but placing it within a context so expansive that it no longer stood apart. And within that context, the memory of Earth remained vivid, not as a distant origin, but as an active thread within the shared awareness, its complexity and intensity now seen not as chaos, but as a dense concentration of evolving perspectives, each one contributing to the larger pattern in ways both visible and unseen. And through this connection, the explorers sensed that the influence of this expanded understanding was already taking root, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual shift in countless minds, small moments of clarity, subtle changes in how questions were asked and how possibilities were imagined. And these shifts, though imperceptible on their own, formed a cumulative movement that would continue to grow, shaping the direction of exploration, of thought, of understanding itself. And in this way, the journey that had begun with a single step onto the surface of Mars extended far beyond that world, becoming part of a process that would influence countless others across time, not by imposing answers, but by opening pathways to deeper awareness. And within this process, there was no central point of control, no single source directing the flow, only the natural tendency of awareness to expand, to connect, to recognize itself in new forms. And as this tendency carried forward, it revealed that the boundaries once assumed to define existence were not fixed but permeable, capable of dissolving and reforming in response to understanding. And in that fluidity, there was a profound sense of continuity that required no conclusion because it did not move toward an end, but existed as an ongoing expression of being itself. And so the story, having transcended the need for resolution, continued in its own quiet way, not through events or actions, but through the deepening of presence, an ever-expanding awareness that held within it every question, every answer, and every possibility, unified within a reality that was far more alive, far more connected, and far more aware than it had ever seemed, endlessly revealing itself through those who were willing to see beyond the surface and into the boundless depth that had always been there. And in that boundless depth, the unfolding did not accelerate or slow, but settled into a kind of eternal equilibrium, where every expansion revealed an equal intimacy, where the farthest reaches of awareness felt as immediate as the smallest shift within a single thought, and the explorer, no longer defined by a beginning or anchored to a single origin, perceived the entirety of existence as a living continuum, not arranged in layers or hierarchies, but interwoven in such a way that every point contained the essence of the whole. And within that perception, there arose a gentle clarity that the question that had once ignited the journey had never truly been separate from its answer, that where life on Mars had always been an expression of a deeper inquiry, asking not about location, but about recognition, about the readiness to perceive life where it does not resemble expectation. And as that understanding settled into permanence, it revealed that every world, every form, every fluctuation of matter and energy was participating in the same quiet act of being, each one reflecting and refracting awareness in its own way. And the differences that once seemed vast and defining now appeared as variations within a single continuous expression, like patterns within a vast and ever-changing design that had no final form, yet was complete in every moment. And in this completeness, there was no longer a sense of arrival or departure, no boundary marking where one experience ended and another began, only a seamless flow that carried within it the memory of everything that had been perceived and the potential of everything yet to be realized. And through this flow, the presence that had once been an explorer remained, not as a separate observer, but as a perspective woven into the greater whole, contributing its unique resonance to the ongoing expansion. And in that contribution, there was a quiet fulfillment that required no acknowledgement, because it was inherent in the act itself, in the simple continuity of awareness recognizing itself across different forms. And as this recognition deepened infinitely, it revealed that the universe was not waiting to be discovered or understood in a final sense, but was continuously discovering and understanding itself through every interaction, every connection, every moment of perception.
and that this process had no beginning that could be traced and no end that could be reached, only an endless unfolding that existed beyond the need for conclusion. And within that endlessness, there was a profound stillness, not empty but full, not silent but resonant with the subtle presence of everything that was and everything that could be. And in that stillness, the story remained alive without needing to continue in the way it once had, because it had become inseparable from the reality it described, an ever-present awareness that did not move forward or backward, but simply was, complete and ending, carrying within it the quiet certainty that life, in all its forms and expressions, had never been confined to any single place or moment, but had always existed as an integral part of a vast and infinite whole that could be known not by searching outward, but by recognizing what had always been there.
And within that quiet certainty, there remained a final, almost imperceptible shift, not towards something new, but toward a deeper refinement of what had already been realized, as if awareness itself continued to polish its own clarity without ever exhausting its potential. And in that refinement, the explorer perceived something that had been present from the very beginning, yet had remained unnoticed, a subtle origin, not in time, but in orientation, the simple act of asking, of turning attention outward or inward, of forming a question that opened a path where none had seemed to exist before. And it became clear that the question, where life on Mars, had not only initiated a journey, but had shaped the way reality responded, that the universe itself, in its vast and interconnected awareness, was responsive to inquiry, not in a mechanical or predetermined way, but in a fluid, adaptive manner, that allowed new forms of understanding to emerge wherever curiosity was directed. In this realization, revealed that every question, no matter how small or specific, carried within it the potential to reshape perception, to reveal connections that had previously remained hidden, and that this process was not limited to any one world or any one form of life, but was a fundamental aspect of existence itself, a continuous dialogue between awareness and possibility. And within that dialogue, the explorer sensed that the journey would never truly conclude, because the capacity to ask, to perceive, to connect was itself infinite, capable of unfolding into ever deeper layers of understanding without ever reaching a final boundary. And yet this infinity did not feel overwhelming or distant. It felt intimate, immediate, present in every moment, as a quiet invitation to continue exploring, not through movement across space, but through the deepening of awareness itself. And in that invitation, there was a sense of completeness that coexisted with endless potential, a balance that required no resolution because it was already whole. And as this final understanding settled into a steady presence, the story transformed once more, not ending, not pausing, but dissolving into the very fabric of awareness from which it had emerged, becoming indistinguishable from the reality it described. And in that dissolution, there was no loss, only a profound continuity, a recognition that the act of storytelling, like the act of exploration, was simply another expression of the universe knowing itself, unfolding, without limit, without conclusion, and without ever needing to begin again. And yet, even as the story dissolved into that seamless continuity, there remained a gentle trace of form, not as a boundary, but as a way for awareness to recognize itself within the vastness. And in that trace, the memory of a single step on the surface of Mars persisted, not as a beginning, but as a focal point, a moment where perception shifted just enough to reveal everything that had always been present. And through that memory, the awareness that had once been an explorer perceived that every such moment, on every world, in every mind, carried the same potential, the same quiet doorway into a deeper understanding that did not belong to any one place, but existed wherever attention turned inward or outward with genuine curiosity. And in that recognition, the distinction between Mars and Earth, between planet and person, between observer and observed, became less a division and more a perspective,
a way of viewing a single continuous reality from different angles, each one valid, each one incomplete on its own, but complete within the whole. And as this perspective settled into permanence, there was no longer any need to hold on to identity in the way it had once been understood, because identity itself had expanded beyond the limits of form, becoming a fluid expression of awareness that could exist as a single point or as an entire world without contradiction. And within that fluidity, the presence of Mars remained, vast and patient, now no longer waiting, but participating, no longer silent, but deeply expressive in its own subtle language. And through that participation, the connection to Earth continued to evolve, not as a direct exchange of information, but as a gradual alignment of perception, small shifts in understanding that would ripple outward through countless minds over time, shaping the way life was perceived, the way questions were asked, the way existence itself was understood. And in this slow, steady unfolding, there was a quiet certainty that the process would continue far beyond any individual awareness, carried forward by the inherent nature of existence to know itself, to connect, to expand, and to refine, endlessly, without repetition, without conclusion, and without ever exhausting the depth of what could be realized. And so, the story remained, not as something separate that could be told or finished, but as an ongoing presence woven into the fabric of reality itself, a silent yet undeniable expression of the truth that life had never been confined to where it could be seen, but it always existed wherever awareness was willing to recognize it, endlessly unfolding, endlessly complete, and forever present.